most people have no clue how big cyber claims can get. So that's a huge potential gap in coverage or, surprise factor that, you don't want to have like all of a sudden $100,000 in costs out of pocket that you thought you were covered for.
Welcome back to another edition of the Mission Secure podcast. Very excited to be with my friend David Hamilton today. David is a certified insurance counselor and a cyber liability expert, I would say. He and I have shared information and data and reports and just intel from both of our industries for, a year or so now. So David, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And thank you for the kind introduction.
Yes. Well, my background is insurance and your background is in MSP, and you flopped to, you switched sides and kind of went to insurance, and I switched sides and went to the MSP. So I feel like we have a lot in common, kind of similar stories, but just took the opposite path. We were connected on LinkedIn. I don't remember who connected us or how, but I just remember seeing your background in cyber liability insurance and also in an MSP. So you started as an MSP. You lived here in Texas, right? You lived right here in Texas and owned an MSP. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, born and raised in Wichita Falls, Texas. Lived there until, I think it was my 40th birthday was around the corner, and, I had vacated the MSP space and wanted to get to the, mountains and trees and Four Seasons again. But we're not too far away from, where you're located. And I think where, your company is as well. So it was kind of a crazy thing. And I was trying to think about how we initially got connected. And I do think it was on LinkedIn, maybe through a post. And then funny enough, found out we've got mutual connections. So
I think so. I think you're right. Okay. So you are where now? And you're not in Texas running your MSP anymore. Where are you?
Correct. So I am in Fort Collins, Colorado. I've been here since June of 22. The MSP days officially ended for me in, I think, summer of 2020. That's when I began the exit officially and started the journey into insurance at that point.
Interesting. That was right before COVID. So what caused you to make that switch?
So it's funny. IT actually ended up being kind of an accidental career for me. I'd never really planned on it. I just, I finished my college degree in forensic pathology, and I was looking for jobs. And as you might imagine, there's not a whole lot of those just, hanging from trees. So I needed a job. Didn't want to live with my parents back in my 20s. So I'm like, okay, let's good with computers. Let's find out how good I am. So that journey really started with literally the Best Buy Geek Squad. Quickly outgrew that. Moved to a small shop and then realized I could kind of build a better mousetrap. So it did that, ran with the MSP. But it was kind of one of those things about, 7-ish years in, I kind of realized that I just wasn't necessarily enjoying the work so much. And in Wichita Falls specifically, which we're, basically 10 minutes from Oklahoma, I was not able to find the talent I needed to grow and kind of, delegate where I needed to kind of, build the future I wanted to. And I'm sure you've had a front row seat to this, but just the way the market is kind of shifted, like all the big boys like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, everything started going really back to that subscription model. So, we were a small enough firm, but it was kind of really edging out profits we could make, and it was making revenue streams. I mean, we were trying to be intentional, but it just felt like every day we were having to rebuild the platforms. So, we kind of reached an inflection point where we wanted to grow, but we were really hitting that hard capacity wall, and the demands kind of got there. And it's like, well, when you're trying to look for new people and you can't find them, I was just having to wear every hat in the company. And it got to be one of those kind of burdens where I'm not an anxious person or a high stress individual, but I was getting there. Yeah. So COVID happens, which, IT, we survived the, housing crisis of 0809. We survived COVID. In fact, if anything, most IT companies got a nice boost from COVID just because you were, ground zero critical, like transferring everybody from a, office environment to the remote hybrid setup. And And, supply chain became a fun thing, and we're still I feel like the bubble from that years later. But I kind of look at the landscape and I was like, I don't know if this is something I really want to continue with. And, the stress level, work-life balance wasn't really in existence. And I shared my office. We shared a hallway with my landlord, who just happened to be my insurance agent. And one day I'm sitting there rethinking life, and I get a knock on the door, and he's holding his paper up. He's like, "David, do you know anything about this cyber stuff?" He's like, "Does it have anything to do with what you do?" And I'm like, I imagine it does. Like, tell me what you're talking about. And so that was a kind of an introduction to cyber insurance, which I didn't even know was a thing.
Oh.
So this was also during COVID, and we're like the only two guys showing up in a 6-block radius keeping the lights on.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, your industry is not disappearing either during this time. So it kind of really put the notion in my head. I'm like, wait, so there's a technology product? Like, I knew nothing about insurance at that point in time. So that kind of put the bug in my ear and kind of ran with it.
Interesting. So you now are a certified insurance counselor. That's a nice certification. And how much do you deal with cyber liability? So do you work for an independent insurance agent, or do you?
Correct.
Okay. So you represent multiple companies, you sell multiple products, but you have honed in and have decided to really become a specialist in cyber liability, which I think is so important. I don't recommend typically that people get their cyber liability insurance from a general agent, down the block, maybe that they've known since they went to high school or college or whatever. So what was it about cyber liability? Because I know it's a newer product. It's a complicated product. Like, there's no, each insurance company has its own policy, its own language, its own coverages. Like, there's not a whole lot of consistency across the different policies with companies. So tell me what drew you to, and I also know that it's probably not your most profitable product that you sell. There's a lot of other policies that you could make a lot more commission on. So, like, what is it that's drawn you to cyber liability?
That's a great question. Yeah, you're 100% correct. Yeah, I work for an independent agency because going into it, I realized the difference is like, okay, I don't want to just be able to sell one product and have that be the end all be all. That just didn't seem like a type of business model I wanted to go into. And cyber specifically, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's in the same vein of the skill set that I've already developed. So while, moving into insurance, it is a tremendous amount of knowledge you have to assimilate. And even 4 years in now, I mean, it's still, just every day there's something that comes up where you're having to learn something completely new or some specific interaction. So, for me, I like puzzles. I'm always curious. So I'm asking questions constantly, and I'm realizing that with cyber specifically, I'm the only one that really, in a lot of cases, knows how to ask questions and what questions need to be asked in the first place. Because you can really train, your Main Street agent to sell cyber. You can give them the guidelines of like, here's a blanket, what it does, and so forth. But really on the back end, if you don't understand what that means, like, take multi-factor authentication. If you don't know how that can be applied and how many different instances it can be applied to one specific scenario of like email access, then you're doing yourself and your clients a disservice because you can't have the full conversation. And it's not that, I think insurance agents don't need to be tech specialists or, IT vendors. They just need to have a competency level because, at the end of the day, that's where you're going to see like claims that may be denied or, coverage problems or surprises that nobody wants. And it's specifically because, every different policy, has, like you said, very individual language. But one thing that's kind of becoming consistent is like a general liability policy. It's going to have a total cyber exclusion in almost every case. Some other policies are going to have this too, but then you may have coverages that kind of line up, like with cyber, the business interruption coverage. Very important to know how that gets triggered and why you need cyber for it, because you also may have that same coverage on a property policy. Two different triggers. So, property, they're really trying to say, look, we only want to cover like what's in this little box here, and we don't want any of this other stuff. So it's, that's why cyber really exists, is because it didn't fit within the other stuff. And I will say too that, Usually, one of the big recommendations I give is if you see cyber as what I call a rider on any other type of coverage, it's usually a couple $100s a year. Your limits are very small, very, very limited on top of what they do. And the policy language is very, very exclusionary for those triggers to meet. So you're really not going to get the benefit of it. And most people have no clue how big cyber claims can get. So that's a huge, huge, potential gap in coverage or, surprise factor that, you don't want to have like all of a sudden $100,000 in costs out of pocket that you thought you were covered for. So
you hit on so many good points there. Oh my gosh, there's so much I want to unpack with you. First of all, let's go back to just the application questions. And you brought up like MFA. So I remember when you could fill out a cyber liability form and application. It was a couple of pages, not a big deal. Now I'm seeing them be pages and pages and pages. And there used to be a question about MFA. Do you have it? Check yes or no. Well, as you alluded to, now we're seeing it, do you have MFA here? And do you have MFA there and here and there? Do you have MFA everywhere you can possibly have it?
Yeah.
And as the business owner, their expertise is running their business. It's not insurance and it's not cybersecurity. And I always find it best, as the MSP, a lot of times we will sit down and help the business owner fill out that application because it is our security that allows them to answer those questions correctly. At the end of the day, it's their personal attestation. It's their signature on the bottom of that application. But the security team and I really think the insurance agent need to sit down together and help the business owner fill that policy out fully and accurately. Because if it's not, and a claim happens, and the insurance company is looking at that application. Now, I'm not the one to paint insurance companies as the big, bad insurance company because I believe we're all in business to make money like anyone else. But if you filled out a policy, an application incorrectly, and you have a claim, you could be in some hot water. Your claim might be denied if you said you have something, but you really don't. And so tell me a little bit more about the application. I know that data encryption is another area. It's not just do you encrypt your data, it's do you encrypt it at rest and do you encrypt it at motion? And specifically, I would like to ask you, I have seen some applications that not only ask the questions, but they want to know the name of the tool. And what I know in cybersecurity to be true is that not all tools are created equal. Some of them have higher detection rates than others. Some of them are higher quality than others. And I believe what I'm seeing is that the insurance companies are catching on to that. The actuaries, it is their job to study where those claims come from and where those losses are occurring. And they're catching on to the fact that if you have a higher quality tool that detects something quicker, they're paying out fewer claims. So talk to me about the application, and then talk to me, are you seeing insurance companies specifically ask for tool names? Is that something that's coming through for you? Or just let's talk about that a little.
Yeah. No, that's great points, great questions. Yeah, to start with the application process. So the fun part about that is some of the top quality carriers, in my opinion, that I work with, they have honestly a very short form, but they do a lot of checking on the back end, which is funny too, because I've seen other carriers that, you may have like 17 pages of very, very detailed, application specifics, diving into like, MFA and all the other stuff. Mm-hmm. So from that, it really, I've kind of seen depends on what risk I'm working with, like what the exposures are, what the business is, on which application I'm going to put in front of them. Because I'll still work with as many carriers as I can, but I'm going to know like, okay, for somebody's specific exposure, if they have like a lot of, AI usage, for example, I know policies that include AI language are going to be the ones that I'm going to gravitate towards. I'm going to want to see, specific sublimits built in and so forth and so on. But the part about the applications where it gets dangerous, it's like you said, that's a material attestation. So if you list things, you can list them in good faith, but I try to tell business owners, like, you may have a good handle on this, but you may not understand the full, spectrum of, or the depth of the question of MFA. Because if it's a single question or if it's only 2 or 3 parts, like you may actually have 7 answers you need to provide. So if they're not there, that's kind of a concerning thing. And if you have an agent who doesn't understand really the difference in the products or really, gravitate towards what the policies do in the end, that can be another problem. So I always recommend, like, talk to your security professional, talk to your IT vendor, your IT staff, your MSP, whoever it is, just talk to them, have them fill out the tech part of the questions with you, go over it with you. Like, don't have them just do it, send it back, and send it to your agent. No, be part of the process, because you may learn some things that you were under a false impression of, or you're like, oh, okay, well, this is clearly an area that, we need to look at. I also do that too, because knowing as an MSP, like, that's an opportunity to create new business for you. If you have a client who's been on the fence with stuff, that's a helpful nod. And it's not just a, kind of a revenue stream. I mean, it's for the purpose of ensuring that, this client is actually going to be capable of what they're representing or improve their posture. Because, for those that have better controls, you might see lower premiums. You might see deductibles that are more reasonable. But I mean, it's got to go hand in hand too, because, what happens on the front end is you collect the information, and there's not usually a whole lot of burden of proof on this stuff. You're sending in a form, you're signing it, and then the typical thing we usually see with most people is it's the assumption of everything is covered now. They get that warm, fuzzy feeling like, okay, well, we did this, we did what we're supposed to, but then they don't realize, like, things change over the years. Or, if they didn't involve their security personnel, they might have misunderstood what something is, or, what they used to have and no longer do. So then you get into a claim, and that's where, insurance, the industry definitely doesn't do itself any favors for public opinion. I will certainly say that from being outside it, now inside it. But it's like, that's the duty of the agent, is to let people know, this is what can happen. These scenarios, this is where the wheels can come off. Here's what you can do to avoid this scenario. And, I kind of like to tell people, it's like, you need to look at things, as a client standpoint, as almost like a 3-legged stool in terms of how you're propping yourself up. So you've got your MSP folks, you've got your IT personnel, you've got cyber insurance at the end of the day, but you also need, like, the security and resilience folks to look at things, because you need a tabletop, you need a stress test, you need to make sure you have a plan and it actually works. Granted, MSPs can do a lot of that work, but, not to dig on them, we used to have medical clients, so we would have to do, audits. And, well, you can't do your own audit because that's like grading your own homework. There's a conflict of interest there. So
say that again for the people in the back. You can't grade your own work. You can't do your own independent audit. And a requirement of HIPAA is that you have an independent audit annually. So
correct.
You can shout that again.
Yeah. Well, and the benefit too, I think a lot of companies, they like to guard things. They look at that as a challenge to their, control of an account, and that somebody else may come in and undercut them, or, slander them, whatever. But I always say, look at it as an opportunity for growth. Find out where you might be falling down, because, it's like, I'm here to try to find people's blind spots and identify them. Well, if other companies I work with aren't of that same mindset, that creates, for me, I'm like, you might not be a good referral source. I may not want to put you in front of a client if I'm worried about you doing your own quality of, assurance testing. So, again, it comes down to, like, the claim happens, and if you can't prove your controls, because that's when the element of proof is going to be, for you to do, right, you're going to have to show all these things that you attested to on the application. And, I like to tell people, this is where claims can be denied. Coverage can partially be canceled. You might have some out of pocket. Or if you're just not prepared, that's where the spiral for, like, third-party claims just can get outrageous. And, if you don't have that third leg of the stool, the resilience aspect, and you haven't stress tested, you don't have a plan, the danger now is you pick up the phone, like, who's the first person most people are going to call? Well, that might be, you, because you help them with IT.
Right.
There's an aspect with coverage now where I strongly encourage people, call the carrier first, get a breach response coach on the phone, because what that does is typically that gives you an element of confidentiality to where that information of said breach is not discoverable information by a plaintiff's attorney. If you call your IT company first, it's going to be discoverable. So you might unfortunately rope them into a lawsuit, then there could be a whole lot of bad things that roll out just because of a well-intended but uninformed decision. So there's a whole lot to that.
Yeah, golly, you hit so many good points there. So let's talk about, you mentioned, I'm going to go back to something you said previously. You talked about like the general liability policies, and some businesses may have a rider or some sort of attachment onto that they believe, it's called a cyber, a cyber rider,
Yeah.
something like that. That
Yeah.
is not the same thing as a cyber liability policy. And I don't believe that people truly understand the differences. First of all, nobody really reads an insurance policy. Let's be real about that, okay? So first of all, they don't understand insurance. Second of all, they don't read their policy. Policies have exclusions. You mentioned sublimits, special limits for different coverages. You may think you have a $1 million policy or a $3 million or a $5 million policy, but when you start looking at the different line items on it, ransomware may have a $250,000 sublimit, and like you mentioned, business interruption, maybe that's a $50,000 limit. Are there any self-retention limits? What are your deductibles? Like, what is your portion of that? And so I want to just hit home on the fact that we're really clear that a BOP policy, business owner's policy with a cyber liability rider offers a very small, if any, real coverage when it comes down to a cyber attack, whereas a cyber liability policy may have a $1 million, $5 million aggregate limit, but your limits within that are much lower, and it's so important. That's where I think that you and I make such a great team. Our industries make such a great team, because when you have my cybersecurity in place, I have seen our clients save thousands of dollars on their insurance premiums because we have the high quality tools and we have all the layers of security that an insurance company wants to see when they're writing a risk. And when you have all of that in place in the proper way, the insurance companies know they're paying out fewer claims. And if they're paying out fewer claims, you're not only going to qualify for the cyber liability policy, because let's be clear, you can't just walk in and get one. You have to have some security measures in place. So you're going to qualify for it, but you're also going to get the broadest coverages and the lowest premiums, which brings me to another point with the BOP policy. Correct me if I'm wrong. It is an all perils policy. So if it's not excluded, it's typically covered, which is why on a lot of BOP policies, there is a cyber exclusion, which is why they tack on that rider, which is actually why you need your standalone cyber liability policy, because it's typically excluded from most coverage is excluded. Would you agree with that? What correct me, fill us in here.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. Kind of my duty at the end of the day when it comes to anything I'm looking at, even if it's a BOP policy with cyber on it, that's the first thing I do. I want to know what your limits are, what coverages are included. Like, if it's a modified, like if it's not an all peril, like, okay, that's important to know right away, because that fundamentally changes the conversation. But at the same time, it's like, I want to look at the exclusions. I want to look at the forms list, the endorsements, because, that's why most people don't read their policies, is because you'll read something that's like, here's what we cover. Now, here's what we don't cover. Then you go down, you find endorsements. Okay, so we're going to modify this so we kind of cover this, but you have to go back up to the top and read. It gets really circular
so
and just
confusing.
bakes your noodle. Yeah, so I tell people basically it's a safe assumption that if you have cyber coverage on any policy that primarily provides you with other coverage, it's probably not the best place for it. Because again, it's what's confusing to people too. You'll see the cyber exclusion on a BOP policy, but then you have the cyber endorsement. So they're like, but wait, which supersedes, what, how does it work together? And that's the problem. If it's not clear and very transparent of what that coverage primarily does, and it's a secondary thing, then, you should not feel confident in it. And I think a lot of people too don't understand the function of a cyber policy, and why I'm always recommending like cyber coverage needs to be its own thing, because the coverage works. It's really two parts. One part of it is your first party coverage. That is, if you as a business sustain a loss, from anything that happens to you, if you don't have, a third party affected by it. So, it's to make you whole. Sometimes like on the BOP policies, depending on the carrier, you'll see where these are primarily for like, either third party exposures or first party, or very little of, either. So it's important to know, like, if obviously the landscape has changed, not a whole lot of people are still doing massive like on-premise servers and so forth, but it's still a good example because like, what if all of a sudden, think back a couple of years ago when Microsoft had a bad update that, broke the airports, like what do you do if you're down for the count? Because I can tell you, if you have a cyber writer, you're going to have very specific wording that's usually going to trend more towards a cyber attack versus a cyber incident. So, that's a very, very important distinction is what is an incident, because if your computers are bricked up, well, that may be no result of an attack, but you're still down regardless. You still have IT bills. You're losing revenue. You're paying payroll, the whole thing. So it's and that's the first party thing. Like if you get hit with ransomware, anything like that. That's what it's important to know. What are those sublimits? Because most times those are still considered sublimits of a cyber policy, but they're going to be substantially larger, usually by an order of magnitude. Let's just use like a 1 million total aggregate policy limit. You're going to see sublimits of like 250,000 versus 25,000. So a substantial difference there.
Yes. Very.
So, and then you go to the other part of the cyber coverage, which is really, this is all the stuff that makes the news. This is the third party aspect of it. So it is funny how many business owners I still run into that aren't really clear on what the liability aspect means, or, the third party aspect. That's your liability to others. So you can sustain damage, but if you have a data breach, that affects your clients, that affects partners, anybody that you're involved with. And that's where the cost really gets in there. So they need to know that part of the policy limit is, and this is why I usually argue no less than 1 million limits. It's because your policy usually has what's called a right and duty to defend. So most of these big data breaches, those end up in lawsuits. So if you have to, seek out legal counsel for like what you have to do, your responsibilities, that's a defense cost. Like your limits start eroding real quick. And as most people are usually aware, lawyers don't do things cheaply or ever for free. So
that's the truth.
So your limits are just, you've poked a hole in it and they just start deflating. So then what if you have to pay notification costs? You have to pay for that. So that's also eroding the limit. What if you have a loss settlement? What if you actually do go to court, class action lawsuit? What does the outward spiral look like? And that's where the policy limits really, really are important. So you want to make sure retentions are meaningful and usable. To basically say like, sometimes having a minimum deductible, and for people that aren't aware, deductibles are deducted from your loss payment. Retentions you pay don't deduct from any loss you receive. Function the same way otherwise. So, if you have a 1,000 retention, may not be the best thing specifically because like your premium might be a little higher because the carrier sees that you don't necessarily have as much skin in the game. So I had to argue for higher retentions because it achieves two things. It makes the carrier more comfortable. You get more favorable premiums. And it also can incentivize the customer to, again, put more skin in the game and make sure those controls are in place. I have one client that I argued for a $25,000 deductible, and they weren't super keen on it, but it was because it was either like, well, you're going to have coverage that has a lot of holes in it, a lot of exclusions, because the carrier said, we'll cover you for, X, Y, and Z exposures, but not A, B, and C, because you're missing some stuff. But I'm like, okay, how can we get this covered? Is the carrier willing to do this under any circumstance? And they said, yeah, put a $25,000 deductible. We'll cover these things. So I know that coverage is going to respond should they need it, while it buys the client time to plug those holes and, get themselves in a good spot. So it's, like I said, it's kind of the puzzle aspect that I like. But it really, at the end of the day, my job is to make sure people understand cyber does not just, any computer event. Like, here's an attack, here's what you can expect, here's an incident, and then the business interruption coverage and how it works differently. So just a lot to it. And those conversations I try to make short and palatable, but as you know, it's like diving into the ocean.
Thanks everybody for tuning in to part 1 with David Hamilton. We have so much more to discuss and unpack. We're going to do a part 2 next week, so I hope that you'll join in.